you saw in the announcement, we talk about climate policy, and it's a little bit of a provocative title, at least from an American perspective, Paris after Trump. An Inconvenient Insight, which is a little bit this allusion to the book by Al Gore, an Inconvenient Insight, if you remember, I think 2001 or 2, where he brought this film about climate change or global warming with a relatively negative perspective, but still optimistic in what we can do. And the Inconvenient Truth, he called it. The Inconvenient Truth was like the frog is sitting in a pot of water which is warming up, and because it's so gradual, you know, and the frog is not put from cold water into hot water, he would jump out. He just stays there and he dies. And so this is his allegory, his picture of about what's happening to mankind. We are basically gradual warming up, at least, not today, that's weather, not climate. And that was his Inconvenient Truth. And I have this co-author, Rutherford, who is an American, and he said, Chris, if you take this title, we will not be accepted by any of our journals. I have to say, we sent it to one journal, it's in the Revised Resubmit, a decent journal, but when I gave it as a preprint to the Harvard paper series, they said they take it, but only if I change the title. Stevens and his climate change group there. So I said, okay, that's fine. I put it as a subtitle, and then that was the agreement. Okay, so long preface. You know, what I talk about is the use of trade instruments to foster climate policy. So therefore, it's not only a climate talk. The framework I present, it's much more general. And actually, like was it this week when at Davos, you know, the US minister again announced we should protect US interest. With tariffs, you have seen protection tariffs against solar panels from China. There was a discussion, of course, against the German automobile industry from the US, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, there is a law in the US which is totally against GATT or WTO, which simply says, oh yeah, if our domestic interests are vulnerated to a critical extent, we can be protective. We can actually say there are import tariffs or non-tariff barriers. So the question then is, if a country for some objective imposes a tariff, is that a credible sanction? And it will be a credible sanction if it basically benefits the sender, in this case the US, and it may vulnerate the recipient. Say Europe, Spain, Germany, or China. And this is a very, usual thing about trade sanctions. The more critical thing is then, what is the scope of retaliation? So if basically US goes ahead with a tariff, and then China says, well, we don't take the tariff and let it be like that, but we also impose tariffs or non-tariff barriers on imports from the US. And if you reiterate, then you get what you call a trade war, right? That's something, if you are more neoclassical oriented and you have your principles of trade, you would say, well, this is not Pareto efficient. We can have a world with trade which is better than a world which is in autonomy or autarky. I don't need to make the examples now that you have to produce your oil here yourself, or Germany would have to produce, say, bananas or mangoes at home and things like that. So I think from the get-go this is relatively simple. And this idea of tariffs as a sanctioning instrument and possible retaliation measures up to a trade war, we basically go through at the example of carbon tariffs. So I make this more general introduction, so for those of you that are not interested in climate change, they would still be able to use that framework and do it to whatever extent in trade. So you say, well, what would be if they go out of NAFTA and there's a trade war between Mexico, Canada, and the US? Who gains and who loses? So now I basically go back to the Trump Tower and to the Paris Eiffelturm. So as most of you may know, in 2015, we got a follow-up of the Kyoto Protocol. This is called now Paris Agreement. Sorry, it was too quick. Exactly.
If you touch the screen, then
it's modern technology. Okay. So the global community came together, and again they made these cheap words, I would say, saying, well, we have to protect climate, we have to make sure that global average temperature does not increase by more than 2 degrees over pre-industrial level, which is why 2 degrees, why 2.5 or 3 or 1.5. This is somehow a magic number which drops from natural science that say, well, if we want to be precautionary, if we want to safeguard against very critical risks, then the 2 degree target is something we should go through. So if you read through what you call the International Panel on Climate Change reports, IPCC, which pop up every 4 or 5 years in the media, then you will see lots of evidence why 2 degrees is something you could or should go for. And how to go for that is that you have to reduce the driver of global anthropogenic climate change, which is actually combustion of fossil fuels. Mostly. There is methane, agriculture plays a role, but let's keep with fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, and all of you, myself included, flying here, driving up with Cassiano, contribute, of course, to global warming. Again, you would say, well, there are benefits from driving, from flying. What are the costs? And the trade-off in a more comprehensive economic analysis would be you do cost-benefit, and then you determine the optimal global warming by trading off at the margin the cost and the benefit. This is not something we do here. So this is not an integrated assessment model or framework, so we don't derive an optimal emission path. We simply say we want to seal emissions align with the 2 degree temperature target, and that's done by emission reduction commitments of most countries against the business as usual. So what happened in Paris is that most countries came up to the table and said, well, we want to reduce our emissions by X% as compared to. And as compared to was very differently labeled. So the Europeans took their EU climate targets, which is 20% by 2020 as compared to 1990 levels. The US said 19% against 2005 levels. China said we are still reluctant to have a fixed emission reduction target. We do it by emission intensity, and we say that our emission intensity, so emissions per GDP, will decline from 2030 onwards, which is not so stringent when saying, well, we seal it at an absolute level, because they still claim we have to go up in the growth ladder to basically be at the same per capita income like Spain or Germany or the US or whatever. Okay. The key issue is, from an incentive perspective, we have this problem, the strategy of global commons, because we have a global public good, this is the atmosphere, and everybody has somehow, from a narrow economic perspective, an incentive to free ride. So, if I reduce emissions here, I would basically have to say no more oil from the mainland or wherever you get it. I have to put up wind, solar, and we believe that at the moment you import oil because wind and solar is more expensive. So if you shift the energy system, that could go along with adjustment costs. So you have less money to spend on a cerveza a la playa or something like that. Okay, and And so, because you think, oh yeah, it will cost me something to reduce my emissions, but my global impact is negligible, I rather free ride. No, if all of you do something, I get the benefit for free because it's a global public good. You can't exclude me, and I don't really contribute. So this is, whatever you make the payoff matrix, you can show this is somehow a prisoner dilemma, and it depends a little bit on the regional benefits and the regional costs to what it can get, a chicken game or whatever, insurance game, whatever you call it in game theory, this type of payoff matrices. But this is also something which we don't go too much in as a game theoretic problem. So we simply say, well, these countries, they made their commitments, unfortunately, because there is no international tribunal, it's all voluntarily. So it's called here INDC, which is intended nationally determined. So the phrasing already says, well, this is probably really cheap talk because it's intended. So whenever they ratified Paris, when the I skips, when it's still nationally, it's still nationally determined. But it's no longer intended because you ratified. But anyway, there is no tribunal that could bring you to court and say you violated your nationally determined target. The same thing which was the problem with Kyoto and will be the future problem with any post-Paris agreement. Right? If you think about Canada, we worked a lot for the Canadian government. Canada had a Kyoto target which they failed by 30% roughly, and then they just said, we don't care, we go off the Kyoto Protocol. They went off the Kyoto Protocol, and all sanctioning, which is written down in the Kyoto Protocol, is gone, because if you are not, you can basically say, I go out, and the only thing you could go for is name and shame. So, oh yeah, these bad Canadians, right? But this is, again, is a repeated game. So when the Canadian left Kyoto, normally they would have to pay for their not fulfillment in the post-Paris agreement with higher reduction targets and actually with penalties. But everybody wanted to have them in, so nobody said, oh yeah, you missed it first place, you have to pay more in terms of higher emission reduction targets. So then we come to Trump, and as you may know, the person is a little bit unconventional or critically unconventional. So he just said, well, I don't believe in climate science. Climate change is a hoax and scrap Paris. So he announced relatively close after, he basically announced it before, so to give him credit. So this was part of his program. And when he became president, he basically announced withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement. The Obama administration did sign Paris shortly before Trump came into force, so that actually made it impossible for Trump to withdraw immediately. There is a certain process, so actually, I think if I'm correctly informed, one day after or before the new election for the president, this will become true, right? So it takes 3 or 4 years to actually go through this process. But anyway, the signal is clear. So other parties then said, luckily maybe for climate, they say, no, we stay with our commitment and we either jump in for the US and we will do more stringent action, and in the hope that the next US president will follow suit. And that's basically then the background for the sanctioning aspect here, where we say, and this is taken from a policy debate, where you say, well, if somebody does not contribute to the global common good, so it's a bad guy, it's a bad boy. So could there be a sanctioning instrument, maybe to bring this guy back, right? So if you drop out, and then I say, well, I have something for you, which is not nice, but if you come back, I will not apply. And then you make your cost-benefit analysis. You say, well, if I keep out, is that more detrimental for me than if I take the sanction? Is that more detrimental than coming back? And depending on the values you get there, you will basically decide to come back, even when the case is the sanction will never be applied, but it's a credible threat. So in the literature, but also in the policy debate, it was suggested, and it's still suggested, to apply carbon tariffs. And the carbon tariff idea is actually pinned down here in these 3 bullet points. So you think about what is the content of carbon in imported goods from the US. So if I have a ton of steel, or if I basically import a ton of wheat, how much direct and indirect emissions are in that good? The direct emissions is clear. You can say, well, I go in the input-output statistics of the US and I look how much fuel is burned in that column. And then you calculate how much tons of CO2 per dollar value, and then you apply a tax on the carbon, which is directly embodied. But then, of course, there is indirect emissions that come from intermediate inputs, like you need steel for producing 1 ton of wheat, and you can do that by a more comprehensive input-output analysis. And we will use this metric, direct and indirect, later on to say, well, in one of the scenarios we impose carbon tariffs if the US goes out, where imports are punished with carbon tariffs. So if we go a little bit into the literature, there are many pros for carbon tariffs from a theoretical economic perspective. This is a clear second best strategy. So if we have only a unilateral policy agenda and a global problem, then Markussen in his paper in JIE 1975 already showed that switching from production-based taxation to consumption-based taxation, which actually means that you import, and on the imports you put tariffs, and as you export you rebate your carbon content. This is better than just having a uniform domestic emission price, right? So if you did the engineering approach, you say minimize cost of emission reduction, then you do Lagrangian, then the shadow price on your emission constraint would be, the shadow price would be the carbon tax or the emission allowance price that you would apply in your authority, but you can't capture emissions that come from outside in trade. And actually, in order to widen then your authority by not really going into the other country, you can't say, if Spain says no, then I could not really come from Germany and say, well, you have to tax, right? But you could do it via trade instruments. And you can show them that this is the second best instrument. So it basically avoids that by means of very uneven carbon pricing, 0 carbon price in Spain, I make the example, and high carbon price in Germany, there is what you call carbon leakage. So emission-intensive industries would go to Spain, whereas the first best would be you have a uniform carbon price all over. Like the marginal cost, if you have a social cost of carbon, you would actually say all consumers of carbon have to pay that social cost. So that would be an internalization of the carbon externality. But as I said, this is a problem if you go beyond borders, and it's a global issue. The environmentalists that basically claim polluter pays principle, they call this carbon tariffing when taxing the carbon footprint. Maybe you are familiar with the carbon footprint literature. This is more or less the same idea. So they embrace it and say we should go more from a production-based to consumption-based method, where even if we are very clean in Spain, but we import dirty goods, we should bill and tax the dirty goods. The industrial lobbyists are also in favor, at least in the countries that face the carbon regulation, because they say, well, this is unfair competition. I produce steel on the Canarian Islands, and the Catalans, they don't have to pay any carbon tax, but we have to, so we basically have a disadvantage. That can't be, so we should have a leveling of the playing field by a carbon tariff and an export rebate. And then what comes closest now to the paper that I'm going to present quickly in more detail is a carbon tariff with trade instrument is that a potential stick in the policy negotiation. So that was something we had in the AHA poll 2 years ago, where we said, a couple of years ago it was different. People were always concerned about China not being part of a climate agreement. It was not Obama and US, it was all about China. And so the suggestion was put carbon tariffs as a trade instrument against China. And then we basically set up an economic model based on empirical data, trade data, and we said how credible is a carbon tariff against China, and we could show with some robustness that against China it's a credible instrument because China will suffer a lot from a carbon tariff, and they would be better saying we comply with some emission reduction than facing the tariff. But in this paper we never had the possibility of a retaliation and a trade war. And the way we put a little bit of a retaliation, but the retaliation was only saying, well, if China faces a carbon tariff, which damages by 3 billion, then they can basically put a 3 billion punishment on imports from other countries. So this is the way how it typically goes in WTO. So Carmelo puts a tariff to me, I say I lose $100. And then I say, well, I basically apply the same measure with $100 lost to you. And so I would, on a simple input-output calculation, I would apply a carbon, maybe a fruit or a car tariff against your exports that come to me. So this is also covered to some extent by WTO, that this is a legal retaliation. But here, in what we do here now is much more comprehensive because we calculate optimal tariffs. So we basically take a full commodity set of 57 goods you will see, which was the database, and we say Carmelo could pick across all 57 commodities the optimal tariff, meaning the tariff that extracts the terms of trade to his advantage. So it's much more computational, it's much more demanding, and it's more comprehensive. So the cases against the carbon tariff would be that you say, sorry, my learning curve is very, I have to keep back now. The case against carbon tariffs, you see it's a lot of self-quotation, so that's not good style, but I have to say this was my main working area, and part of what I cite here are also overview articles that cover a lot of other people. So here in this room, I don't violate too many people because you have different fields, but normally if I talk about like at an environmental conference, probably some people would say this ignorant guy, I did much more relevant stuff. Anyway, the ideas keep the same, whoever is quoted here, and if I quote myself, I know at least what I did. So one issue is, if you put a carbon tariff in a trade model, which is, then what I would call a price-responsive input-output framework, what you want to achieve is, from a social planner perspective, you come closer to the first best. And the first best clearly would be emission pricing uniform across the world. You can't do that. So at least you put it to the imports and the exports. You relax your exports with rebates, you basically burden your imports with a carbon tariff. Okay? And it turns out that if you compare a run where you don't have a carbon tariff with a run where you have a carbon tariff, the global cost of emission reduction, to reduce emissions worldwide by 5 or 10%, the cost savings are minimal, which suggests that carbon tariffs are not really a very effective instrument. And one reason is typically you apply carbon tariffs at the industry average level. So if Cassiano produces steel, he's actually burdened with the carbon tariff of the average embodied carbon for the Canadian steel industry. Whether he is very dirty or whether he is very clean does not matter, right? It's the average content that is typically applied in real policy practice. So therefore, you know, for him to say, well, I have an incentive to switch from coal to gas in my production is very, very, very small. If he is an atomistic part of the Canadian economy, then he will not change the average carbon content in the steel industry on the Canadian island. So therefore, the incentive is very, very different when you would have a direct carbon tax on gas inputs in his production. So therefore, these carbon tariffs are relatively blunt from if applied to an average industry level. And the other issue which is relevant in terms of price responsiveness is there's a lot of scope for what I call rerouting. So if he faces carbon tariffs from me, he just ships the stuff to you, right? So this would be a typical substitution effect, an escape effect. And that's something which also plays a very critical role. So then, so these two aspects rather say, well, carbon tariffs are not very effective, and if there is a risk of a trade war, don't touch it. Right? If you basically apply, and I have a quote from Stebbins at the end from this Harvard colleague who says, well, you know, would you think that if you apply a carbon tariff against the US that Trump would not retaliate? No, this guy will retaliate, and then we may end up in a trade war. So the carbon tariff might be seen, at least if you say climate change is a hoax, then you would say this is just an excuse to basically make our imports more expensive. And I will retaliate, right? So this is something that you could call a backdoor trade policy instrument. I'm speeding up a little bit. So the focus of the analysis I'm going to present is to what extent could we think about carbon tariffs as a strategic instrument? And it's not so different than, is it a carbon tariff, it's a steel content tariff or whatever. But here in this application we talk about climate policy. So then whatever you think about, is it credible? You have to say, do the tariffs benefit the users? Do they punish targets? That would be the first round. So that's something that we basically had in our previous paper. And that's actually the point that Nordhaus covers in his more recent AER article, where he says carbon tariffs are effective, but he never goes beyond that, and he never says, well, you know, China could retaliate or US could retaliate. And then we show then that the picture can change a lot. So he claims carbon tariffs should be used, and they are effective, but if you do the retaliation game, they are no longer a credible instrument. So if we translate these questions to our analysis, Paris after Trump, then the question is, the US is going off from Paris. So if we now, as a sanctioning instrument, apply carbon tariffs, will the US do worse than if they would say, well, oh, we better go back and we avoid the carbon tariff? So this is, do they punish the targets, really? But then the other question is, well, if the US retaliates with optimal tariffs, how does the picture look like? And then the final end game would be a war, a trade war. So multiple countries basically try to impose in a Nash game their optimal response. And that's basically what we compute later on. That's relatively innovative. We haven't seen that before in the trade literature even. So now for 2 minutes you're full focus, because I tell you the scenarios. I will tell you a little bit then about the method we apply, but the scenarios are important that you keep this in mind. They are to some extent self-explaining, but here is a more detailed explanation here. Paris is the reference case. Paris is, okay, people came to Paris, they signed, and they made their commitments. So now in the analysis we have to translate these commitments in effective reduction targets. This is not something which is what you would say bulletproof science, because if we talk about China with the intensity targets, you have to think about how do this GDP numbers evolve, what is the energy trajectory, and so on and so forth. So you have to make some assumptions. And we said we keep the noise of ignorance or we keep that as small as possible. So our database that we use is 2011. This is empirical data. And then we say what would the commitments under Paris translate to in 2011 in terms of emission reduction requirements. So USA had an emission reduction requirement, I think, of 28% by 2025 vis-a-vis 2005. We do some calculation, which is in the appendix, and we say this effectively would mean, from 2011 perspective, 19% emission reduction. China 5, Europe 30, 27 of other OECD, and remaining G 28%. And then we have middle income and low income countries. They don't have any emission reduction target. So clearly this is a candidate for sensitivity analysis, but one thing is, these numbers are still relatively low in terms of the ambition level if you think about the 2-degree temperature target. So this is rather a low target, a low ambition estimate. Clearly the ratios also play a role, but this is, qualitatively it reflects that Europe has a relatively ambitious target, China low, and US is somehow in between. So this is basically what we do in the scenario Paris is that we say we have an existing economic structure with consumption preference, production technologies, and then we impose a shock where we have to reduce emission use by 19%. And to bring down the emission by 19%, we put a carbon price, and then production consumption will adjust to reduce. So we have fuel switching, we have energy savings, right, by capital energy substitution, and so on and so forth. Then US out means all other countries keep their Paris targets, but US goes out. Carbon tariff means US is out, and then Europe and China apply a carbon tariff on US imports. Not the other countries, because these other countries we kept as aggregates, and then it's always difficult basically to say we have a streamlined policy among other OECD or remaining G20, which would be whatever, India and Brazil. This is too heterogeneous, right? So we play our Nash game later on at the level of these three countries, of the US, China, and Europe. Retaliation says then that if Europe and China apply the carbon tariff, then US will retaliate with optimal tariffs. So they will basically seek, they will run the model, if they believe the model, and then they say what is the optimal tariff on imports of goods from China, and this is a multi-dimensional, so it basically is a space of 57 different commodities, from grain to clothes or whatever. And then the tariff war says, oh yeah, if we have optimal tariffs from the US, then Europe and China will retaliate themselves, and then we go for a best response game where we have optimal tariffs in the end. So typically you do that in a 2x2 graph in your classroom, and when you basically make you draw your response functions, and when you have an equilibrium. Here it's of course much more complicated, but the idea is the same. So the policy implementation, I already said, for achieving the Paris targets, every country that basically comply to do emission reduction puts in a carbon price sufficiently high to achieve the emission reduction target. And whether it's a carbon tax or you put it as an emission allowance system, the cap and trade does not matter, because the allowance price is nothing else than the carbon tax that would achieve exactly the budget of emissions that you put under an EU ETS. So this is a one-to-one equivalence. The carbon tariffs in the carbon tariff scenario are levied on US imports to Europe and China, and you apply the domestic carbon price, either the ETS price or the carbon tax, to the carbon content of imports. And the carbon content of imports is not only direct emissions, but direct emissions plus embodied emissions from electricity. Here you could go one point further and say we take the full embodied carbon. So you do a full multi-region input-output calculus, but this is we look through the legal aspects. This is a little bit more demanding, so people agree, scholars agree that direct emissions plus indirect emissions would be something which could be legally relatively simple. And if you look for the numbers, then direct emissions plus indirect emissions from electricity cover most of the emissions in terms of embodied emissions. So again, that would mean 1 ton of steel produced in Pittsburgh, you burn there so much oil, coal, gas, that would be the direct emissions, but then in the production process, you have workers that drink beer. For producing the beer, you need to have electricity. So this electricity, which is basically, no, that would be full calculation. So here it would be coal, oil, gas, but you also need electricity, and then you would see how you produce electricity in the US, and you would take the average electricity carbon content, and you would put it up to the direct plus indirect here. So then there is one important issue which does not in the end play a role for the policy conclusions, but you should be aware of that. Initially, the Carmela works on consumer preference, so the issue is what's the valuation of 1 ton of carbon in terms of a benefit of avoided damage. And it might be very, very different. The social cost of carbon under Obama was 40, under Trump it's 4 now or 5. We refrain from doing evaluation of the avoided damages by reducing emissions. So what we keep here is a global cost effectiveness analysis. So we say we start with the Paris Agreement, and that brings down the global emissions, say, by 8% or 10%. Okay? And then we say if the US drops out, we keep the global emissions constant, because then we have global externalities the same across the 2 scenarios, and we don't have to value emissions, which would be higher or lower otherwise. And by separability of the public good and the private goods, then we can purely focus on cost in terms of a money metric utility, the Higgshian equivalent variation in our case. So if the US drops out, it's clear there is one country that no longer emits. To reach the same global emission reduction targets, other countries have to do more. So here we have a mechanism which may at first case be a little bit unrealistic, because people say, well, if he leaves, why should I do more? At least I stay in the party or in the commitment, but why should I do more? But we took the announcements of several countries that said, well, we will even step in for US as reality. And as I say, if we do other calculations where we value with the social cost of carbon at different levels, the conclusions still keep the same. So a few words, I have to look on the watch. But the weather is so bad, you can stay here until the evening, I presume, right now. So we have, the framework we apply with the optimal tariff setting is what you would call an MPEG. So we have a utility function where we say a country with an index S maximizes its welfare, and it has a policy instrument which is the strategic set of tariffs. And so it picks the tariff rates such that it maximizes its own welfare, subject to what here is the equilibrium constraint. So basically zero profit market income balance. So these are equilibrium conditions in the long run, and basically you say I have a strategic instrument, I have to keep with this side constraint here, but I have a T as a strategic instrument. So we compute net equilibrium. Typically, if you work with the model I usually apply is a computable general equilibrium model, you normally don't have strategic instruments. You simply say, I put in a tariff or I put in a tax, but you don't say, I optimize over tax. What would be the best tax structure for the Canarian island to basically to supply a certain level of public goods, to basically pay the teacher here, to clean up the playa, meaning, what would be a great value-added differentiation. You could do that with this model as well. So this is something computational relatively demanding for a non-engineer or non-techie economist, maybe not that so important, but probably this is the high art of computation, like you have some high art in econometrics. So before we go in the result, just the basic intuition from the textbook. What is the optimal tariff? The optimal tariff is actually the tariff rate where you equate at the margin the gains from improved terms of trade against the marginal efficiency losses that you basically face in your production and consumption. So because you have elastic supply-demand functions in all goods from all countries, you put in a tax wedge. You drive down, for example, the supply price with an oil tax, the supply price of the Saudis, right? So part of the distortions you create in production consumption, you can offset or even overcompensate by having lower prices for oil that you have to pay. Right? If you have a fully inelastic supply function by the Saudis, you could actually have a tax that drives down their supply price to zero. So it's the 1, 2, 3 idea that you already get in microeconomics, so I'm not sure whether I should draw it, but you have a fully inelastic supply curve, a demand curve, so the full incidence of a tax falls on the fully inelastic supply. And in terms of trade, extraction via optimal tariffs goes in the same way, so you basically would think about what are export supply functions of my competitors or my trading partners that are relatively inelastic, and you would try to put, as you do in the monopoly markup, you put an inverse to the export supply function. An inverse meaning you take the inverse of the export supply elasticity to be your optimal tariff. It's the same thing like you would do with the optimal markup. And you can go up and up and up to the point where you have the welfare maximum, and if you then overdo, you have too high tariffs in this case, then you go down again, right? So a lot of what you can extract from your instrument of optimal tariffs is your trade position. What are the initial trade shares and so on and so forth. And what are the initially existing tariff rates. So here you see the model as a sketch that we apply. It's a schematic input-output representation where we produce goods domestically, a good commodity I in region R. We use factors to do that. The output of a sector goes first in export, or it goes together with imports from other countries to form your intermediate good, which goes in consumption or goes as an intermediate input into domestic production. So this would be your typical input-output structure. And the carbon tariff actually applies where we say we put a tariff on commodity I, which is shipped from region S to region R, right? So, this good I and R can have multiple dimensions. So what, first case, if you want to know how does the production look like, you look in an input-output table, you see there are intermediate inputs, there are capital and labor inputs, resource inputs, and if you make the production being price responsive, you have to take flexible functional forms, cost functions that could be translog, but here we use nested CS functions because the mathematical properties are more regular. And when you see what I what I showed here in a very abstract level translates here in a more concrete level. So we take capital labor inputs, we take capital labor inputs, we combine it with intermediate inputs that are non-energy, that's the capital labor material. We have energy inputs, and we go up, so this would be the capital labor energy material output at this point. This trades off to go to the export or to the domestic supply. And if we think about what goods do we use in production or consumption, it's always a composite of imported goods and domestically produced goods. And you see here the circles, red and blue, and the blue circles actually indicate that these elasticities are crucial for driving the marginal cost of emission reduction. And clearly, the higher the elasticities of substitution between different fuels like coal, oil, gas, the lower are the costs at the margin, because the easier it is that you substitute. If you have here a relatively high substitution between energy and other inputs, substitution is also quite easy. So these blue bars actually tell you about the marginal cost of carbon. Say you have an emission reduction target, how much must be the carbon price to reduce your emissions? More relevant in the tariff application are the red circles. These are these elasticities that drive this inverse markup rule. So it's the export supply elasticity and the import demand elasticities that play a role. And so the more inelastic these are, then the higher could be the carbon tariff, or not the optimal tariff that you apply as an inverse on your elasticity. So for those people, a couple here are more applied people. We use input-output data from the GTAP framework, and I said already that the data source is 2011. So the GTAP consortium covers data for 140 regions worldwide with disaggregation into 57 sectors, and this is full input-output tables and bilateral trade data. So we basically can apply bilateral tariff rates because we know the bilateral trade flows, right? And then it also captures emissions, and there are some estimates in the database on the blue circles and the red circles that I showed you before, right? And so it's basically then this structure here gets calibrated to the 2011 data with the cost shares and the expenditure shares and the elasticities, subject to the responsiveness with these elasticities on the production side, and then you apply the shocks that I laid out in these scenarios. Okay? So we don't work with 140 countries here, but we work with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 countries. And we focus on these 3 countries. But what we keep is the 57 sectors, because the optimal tariffs will very much depend on the aggregation of the commodities. So we keep, as we make a tariff game, we keep original data from GTAP. We don't aggregate between US and China. Europe is now aggregated across the countries, the EU 28, but within Europe you don't have tariffs against each other. So this is okay. And then here we keep the whole structure, so the Trump administrative officers could basically say what are the optimal tariffs across 57 goods. So this is a relatively high dimensional setting then. So to explain now the results, starting from the base year data, key aspects are, of course, how much I'm vulnerated as a US from carbon tariffs, and how much would I be, for example, retaliated from tariffs on my imports as China. So then we have the average embodied carbon content that plays a role, and the average export share. And for example, you see here that China stands out for having the highest embodied carbon content and having the highest average export share, which is not so surprising, but it will mean later on that if you have tariffs on China because of the trade exposure, China is relatively high exposed, right? So if we look here in terms of the relevance of these countries, we see that the global emissions that the three countries cover is more than 50%. They cover more than 50% of the GDP share. And we see especially that China has a very, very trade openness. So if you take the trade as a percentage of GDP, it basically goes to 53. So I see I have to come to the results, 2 more slides for the results, and then 1 slide with the final conclusions. Hopefully you still remember the different scenarios, right? Paris was the one where we implemented the emission reductions as submitted at the table. We translated it somehow. So you will see, if we run the model, we put in as a side constraint, US has to reduce emissions by 19%, and that clearly, if there is no leakage in the model or something wrong, it should pop up with 19%. So these are the initial claims by countries to reduce, and that basically is a side constraint, so it comes out. So you see, Paris then would only reach roughly 12% emission reduction at the global level as compared to 2011 levels. This is, with respect to the 2-degree temperature target, it's not a lot. So therefore we are here in the stringency, we are on a relatively low side. Then what you see here in the B part is what we call leakage. So we have countries, US, China, Europe, other OECD, and remaining G20, these countries do have explicit emission reduction targets. Other countries more or less had very loose targets, and we do not believe they will really keep them, so they don't have any emission constraint. And as those countries impose emission constraints, there is what you call leakage. Other countries increase because they get a comparative advantage in producing emission-intensive goods. So people would maybe ship out to Sri Lanka or some country in South America because it's cheaper to produce steel there than in Europe, China, US, or some other countries. So the leakage rate then measures the emission reduction in countries that have binding emission constraints. This is basically in the denominator, and the emission change in the numerator in countries that don't have emission constraints. So if you see a leakage rate of 10%, it means if Carmelo is a constraint with emission reduction, he reduces by a ton, then I will offset, if I don't have an emission constraint, by 10% of a ton, so by 100 kilogram. If you have a leakage rate of 100%, the net effect would be 0. Okay? So therefore, leakage, the higher the leakage rate, the less effective is your unilateral, your sub-global action. So then the leakage rates are here relatively small because all big emitters are actually covered by Paris. There are only a few countries, low-income, middle-income countries that don't have emission constraints. So then US goes out in the second section here, second column. That means that US also has a comparative advantage. There is a relocation of industries to the US or the existing industry there scale up their production. So US, as compared to the 2011 BAU, without doing nothing, has an increase of 3.2%. Very slightly increased, but also something which would basically make sense from intuitive thinking. As you see, we keep the emission constraint here with 11.8 the same. That was what I announced to you. So this is somehow, the outcome from -9 to 3.2 says, oh yeah, we have to make up for a lot of emissions that the US no longer cuts. And you see that the emission reductions here are scaled up. And how we do that is that we scale the initial emission commitments proportionally. So all countries that are in the emission club, they basically say we make 10% more or 15% or whatever. So that's of course a criticism whether this is realistic or not. As I said, if we give up this scaling, we no longer can do a cost effectiveness analysis. When either we have to say emissions do not play a role at all, and if we do that, we will see that the welfare numbers do not change in terms of whether carbon tariffs are a credible threat or not, or we have to evaluate emissions by somehow social cost of carbon. So for all the rest, we keep it, as I say, at 12%, but you see that in the carbon tariff retaliation or tariff war, the changes in the emission reduction do not play a big role. So the emission consumption production patterns do not really change a lot by this trade wars that are going then on. You see the one thing that as we take US out of the Paris Agreement, the leakage rate goes up because before the US was in the club, now it's out and it contributes to leakage with 4.2%. So a total global leakage rate of 11.6%, 4.2% now comes from the US because they increase their emissions as compared to BAU. So final set of results. So this column here in the C table tells you what are the marginal costs of abatement, meaning what is the emission price necessary, for example, in the US to achieve the 19%. And this is all driven by the marginal abatement cost curve, how steep this is. If you have a country, say Norway or Switzerland, which is very much on hydro and nuclear, in the Swiss case, they have very, very little carbon to start with. If they have to decarbonize, they have to go to the traffic system where it's really, really expensive. Because for the time being, it's quite expensive to go from, say, from a fuel-based car to an electrical car. And so you see that it's relatively, so it's basically the curvature, the steepness of a marginal abatement cost curve, which is different across countries depending on their preferences and technologies. But it's also the higher the emission reduction target, the more expensive it becomes. So it's a convex curve that enters, that goes from the origin and then goes up. So you see that Europe, which is already relatively decarbonized with a very ambitious emission reduction target of 30%, has a relatively high carbon price. So CO2 price of 162, which is way off from the €5 we see at the moment in the EU ETS, right? Anyway, so if we basically then we look at the marginal cost, then we see that as the US goes out, of course there must be a zero because there is no longer emission reduction in the US. And the other countries, because they scale up their emission reduction target, they have higher abatement cost at the margin. Right? Again, you see then, if you go further to the trade games, to the trade war variants, that the imposition of the tariffs and the retaliatory tariffs, carbon tariffs and retaliation, does not really affect at the margin the cost of abatement, which is relatively intuitive. You have to cut back emissions, and how you do that mostly depends on how good you can do fuel switching, what's your preference for energy savings, how easily you can switch off your heating at home, and so on and so forth. So now, the last three rows here together, and I basically shaded US as the answer to the questions that we had initially. So if you translate the marginal cost to inframarginal cost, we basically have to measure what are the consumption losses by imposing a tax, right? The general idea would be the higher the tax, the more is the efficiency loss, if you look at the Harburger triangle. But there are many other forces that play a role. For example, how you have initial taxes interacting with the new tax, how your export-import prices change. So it's a more complicated than just going to the typical Harburger triangle and say, well, the higher the marginal cost of carbon is, the higher should be the welfare loss. In fact, if we think about the typical terms of trade aspect, every country in this model, but if you believe that the model is reality, you could also say in the world, would have a scope to levy a carbon tax or an emission tax and be better off because they just would go along the U-shaped, inverted U-shaped optimal tariff line, right? You could basically say, if I don't have a possibility to extract optimal tariffs across all sorts of goods, I just can use a carbon tariff or a carbon tax as a precuse to do something good for the environment, but I make some goods more expensive that other people can't substitute easily away, and then you already extract terms of trade. So this is always something I have problems to communicate, even in the trade theory this is clear for decades. You can extract terms of trade by strategic tariffs. But of course, if you have a carbon tax, this is nothing else than a sort of a tariff, an indirect tariff, and you can basically switch to and fro, so you basically have some, to a critical level, say $20, $30 per dollar, you have a welfare gain. But if you talk to the EU Commission or to the Spanish government or to Trump, and you would say, well, is that the trade structure you believe in? He says, yes. When you say, well, then let's basically impose a carbon tariff. It's good for your economy. He would say, no, I see steel industry closes down and so on and so forth. But it's exactly the same mechanism that you would say a monopoly producer shrinks the output to have a higher markup. Anyway. So you see US loses 0.25% of, say, GDP. And then if they go out, your basic intuition without any GE framework, maybe you say input-output not connected, is they go back to zero. So they are back to the business as usual. If we measure the change to business as usual, it would be zero. Here, of course, there are feedback and spillover policy effect from the other countries, but it's close to zero. Right? So there is not a lot how in the total US would be affected by other countries. You might even think it should go positive because as other countries do reduce, you have a comparative advantage. But now the issue is other countries, Europe and China, put on the tariff, and you see that 21 is in this case a smaller loss than 25. Right? So, so in this parametrization, US would prefer the carbon tariff over Paris. So they would rather say, we don't go back to Paris, but we stick with the carbon tariff. We basically go out and we take as a sanction, we take the carbon tariff. Now clearly, if you work a lot with these models or you know data, and you go from one base here to another base here, this is not a big difference. So the question is how robust it is. And the answer is, say this goes to 0.3. Then you could claim it's a tariff would be an effective instrument because the US, if they would react rational, would say, well, we rather go back to Paris than accepting the, right? So there is a little bit of, say, there's a little bit of, I wouldn't call it non-robustness, but depending on what emission reduction targets you apply here, how you scale emission here as a compensating mechanism, what base you take, what elasticities, this value could be lower or higher, and then could be better or worse than this one. But this is actually not what we are so much interested in. We are interested in, oh yeah, don't stick with this column, but go to retaliation and think about what happens if the US says we don't accept the carbon tariff, we retaliate. When you see if they do the optimal tariff choices that I showed to you over 57 goods, and I can show you the numbers, what would be the optimal tariff for each commodity, then they are more or less back to their business as usual, right? So, and with this setting, you can play around with elasticities, you can play around with base years. The trade structure does not change that much over 10 years. So the US is relatively, compared, for example, to China, it's by far not that trade open. So that's a relatively robust figure. And so the effect of retaliation keeps relatively robust, meaning that the carbon tariff for the US, because it's not so trade open, is not a credible instrument. So the final thing is when, there could be a trade war if other countries like China and Europe apply optimal tariffs in a Nash response. And then you see it's 0.5, so this would be a much higher cost than staying in Paris. So you could say if at the end Trump says, at the end there is a trade war, it costs me double as much as sticking with Paris, shouldn't I be rational and keep there? Okay? But the answer is, from a US perspective, that would make sense, but the carbon tariff is still not a credible instrument, because China in particular, if China would basically end up being retaliated or playing back then with a tariff war, they are still way worse than saying, well, we keep with US being out, right? So the credibility of the tariff is the punished entity, or is the entity that is the recipient of a tariff, is that punished, and do I benefit, or I do at least not make myself worse off? But here it's clear that as you apply the carbon tariff, you see that China is doing better than saying we just put up with US not being in the Paris Agreement. So at that point, the tariff would make sense for China, because they go back from 0.3 to 0.16. But if the US retaliates and China would basically anticipate that, then because of their trade openness, they would really face a big loss, and even if they retaliate with their optimal tariff strategy, they would be far off from what would they preferable under US out. Okay, so then I conclude. So in a nutshell, and these are relatively robust results, so we have a whole section with sensitivity analysis, here dimensions in selection. I don't go into that because we run out of time, or are already out of time. So the Paris Agreement imposes non-negligible cross-economic costs for the US, be it 0.25 or 0.5 or 1%. I don't want to be too generous, because 0.5% GDP or 1% makes a big difference. But this is not the message here. The message is the costs are non-negligible, and they are likely, if I don't account for the benefit of greenhouse gas emission abatement, to be even higher, because the US will not be able to stay just with 9% emission reduction. They have to do more. Okay, so they are cost. If they go back, they are back to business as usual. This is not so surprising. Although I have a more flexible framework with spillover effects, terms of trade effects that you would not see in a static input-output analysis or a first guess estimate. So, okay, then the carbon tariff, what we see, harms the US and it benefits the sending regions. In our specific case, so this is a 1-point estimate that I showed to you. So an econometrician would say, well, this is very, very little evidence. Here we saw it's not sufficient to bring back US to the table. Right? It was 0.21 versus 0.25, so they would rather say, well, we take the carbon tariff than going back. But again, this is not the point, even if we had a 0.28 instead of 0.21 or something like that, so it would be a credible threat from a single run. If we think about the retaliation, we make the picture broader, it would not be something which is credible, because the US says, I don't really pick up. I want to be out of Paris. If you put carbon tariffs and you hurt me, I will retaliate. And retaliation now for the US is relatively beneficial and is particularly harmful for China. which has to do with the trade statistics that I present in a nutshell to you, the export orientation or the trade openness. And the tariff war then will not really picture differently, because China is still really bad off. Although the US would be worse off than under Paris, China would be much worse off than saying, well, we don't really apply a trade war, we keep them better with the US being out. Okay, so at this point I'm finished. I'd like to thank you for your attention. Not really sure how I did with the time, but Cassiano said you can take as long as you want, so I always blame the host. Okay, so I think if there are questions, we still have like a couple of minutes. So, yeah, so I start maybe from, and then yeah.
So am I right thinking that, it was a great work, thanks. So am I right thinking that the rerouting idea of emissions is already connected with the cross elasticities, or it could be a problem running for your results and how? You didn't present much about the sensitivity analysis, right? So I feel a bit of conflict with point estimations for this.
Yeah.
The assumptions.
So clearly, if you go, if you ask yourself how robust are these results, and you write down algebraically the cost functions, which is the characterization of the production side, and the expenditure functions, which is the dual for the consumption side. What matters is the cost shares, the expenditure shares, and the elasticities, right? Because that basically that drives your demand response. So here I already allocated the elasticities which are central. On the one hand, to how much is the cost of emission abatement. Because if the US has very, very low cost of reducing, all the games that we play may not be relevant, because to start with, they don't have really high cost, right? So your point was now, if I understand correctly, I have a carbon tariff. I apply it to imports from China or from the US. How much will be their rerouting of emissions? And that's clearly then, if we go back to to this structure, we say, okay, if you produce or you consume in the Canarian Islands, you take a ton of bananas for production, or of banana juice, or you eat them at home, then it's partly consisting of bananas from here and partly of bananas from other countries, that may be Ecuador, not yet UK or whatever. So this is basically the import composite, and there is an elasticity of substitution, which is based on econometric estimates. So, the rough number would be here, 16 or 8, relatively high. And then there is a trade-off between using the domestic banana and the imported banana, or the domestic wine, imported wine. So this is this Abatement assumption, therefore it pops up here, of product heterogeneity by source. And the closer you make these elasticities, the better are these substitutes. So the more rerouting you would have, right? Because then you would say, on the export supply side, if I face an import tariff from Europe, I just ship it to another country, and because it's a relatively homogeneous good, I can switch it very easily. So the higher these elasticities, the more you come from a heterogeneous product world to a hexaline homogeneous setting, right? So you could also run the whole model. This is, I would say, old trade, because it's perfect competition, but at the moment we do analysis for the Brits on the Brexit, so there we use the Mellitz type model with new trade theory, so product heterogeneity, monopolistic competition. It would be interesting to see then how the same analysis works with other trade theory. So this is classical trade theory, and of course then these assumptions play a role apart from the elasticities. But the rerouting will be critically affected by these elasticities as well. When I go here, yeah.
No, I do like it, the presentation and the work. It's very interesting. One issue that comes to my mind is the way you define welfare, because the main reason behind all this is precisely CO2 reduction. Is completely missed out of your welfare definition. So that was my concern.
It's a very well-taken concern, even to a point where, what do you talk about? But I would defend in the way that if you go to the negotiation levels, and I had been there some years ago, and you rather go to the short to mid-term, all that matters is the cost. There may be an incidence of a disaster, weather disaster, or then you say, well, in the long run it's more climate disaster, and that could basically, from a political economy perspective, bring out the willingness to pay by the population, and then say, well, avoided climate damage really plays a role. But in the negotiation level, if you also look around, the real willingness to pay for climate abatement is not really high. It's relatively low. I take your point, and my explanation was a little bit more technical to defend. I said, well, if we don't value emissions by avoided damages, then to do a coherent analysis, we have to keep, for welfare comparison, we have to keep the global emission reduction or the global level of emissions constant. Because otherwise we compare apple with pears. We say, in the one scenario we have higher emissions, in the other we don't. Well, if I say people don't care for emissions anyway, I could do probably, because the emissions do not play a role. But here we at least say the emission level must be the same. You can do, and that's something we have to do for the revision, you can actually say, I look across the announcement of countries on their contribution to the climate problem. So then you go back here and you say, these are the contributions, 90%, 5%, 30%, and then you could take the model and you could say, what pops up here then, if the US says, I want to contribute with 19%, then there, and you compute the marginal cost of abatement, then that would be, actually you could take that as their contribution, as their marginal evaluation of the cost. And then you would actually, in the simulations later on, you would no longer put this emission constraint on, but you would say, I evaluate higher or lower emissions for the US by multiplying each ton with $19. Right? So this is, but the problem then is the $19, is this the social cost of carbon from the US? Is the 132 the willingness to pay from the EU? It's a little bit of difficulty, because I make this example for the EU, like lots of my research was on the low carbon price of the EU. So you compute something with the EU ETS, the EU emission trading system, and you say what we see at the moment is $5. Is that the willingness to pay by the EU? Well, the issue is, no, it's probably much higher, because you have huge renewable subsidies. Like, take alone, Germany puts 25 billion per year in renewables. And the effect is that you drive down the CO2 price in the EU by a lot. Because as you foster solar and wind, you could do it to 100% when the ETS system would be, the emission price on the bound would be zero. And then you compute, the question is, what is the real willingness to pay? So you could do contingent valuation or whatever techniques. But as I said, we already breed it with simulations with some assumed valuation on the carbon damage. So globally, that would be the social cost of carbon if there is agreement, but there is disagreement across countries. And then we could take these numbers, and the picture does not change. It does not change.
Yes,
My question is very simple. It's about the idea. I think that my understanding, the takeaway message, it looks like that a carbon tariff is may not be such a good idea, no? For some countries.
For some countries,
yes.
Yeah.
Because it can evolve in a tariff war or so. But to what extent this can be contradictory, because trade policies are very controversial, the World Trade Agreements and so on.
Yeah.
So, to what extent is this feasible in the World Trade Organization? Is one question. And the other one is, this imposition of carbon trade tariffs, is there any other externality which has been tackled with trade policies and so on, has been successful?
Valid point. So if I repeat to some extent, you think that the idea of a carbon tariff to start with for curing an externality is something which is politically out of discussion, if I put it. And my point is, if you go into the policy debate over the last years, it was Sarkozy, it was the Mexican minister who said, if the US withdraw from Paris, we should use carbon tariffs. Years before, it was the Obama administration who said, well, if China, they come to Paris and they don't bring sufficient stuff with them, we want to have a carbon tariff against them. So I think the idea of a carbon tariff in moral terms is something which has appeal, because people say, well, there are good people, good countries and bad countries. The good countries do emission reduction, the bad countries don't do anything. So we have a right to actually go via the court, and if you look, I think it's Article 20 under WTO, you can have tariffs on stuff which is damaging. Environmentally damaging. So there is a legal case, and we had one round with the Energy Modeling Forum 3 or 4 years ago on the carbon tariffs that then also included lawyers. And the saying by the lawyers was that the carbon tariffs is something that could be legally pushed through. Sometimes you call it border carbon adjustment, but border carbon adjustment are something which has a high probability to be approved. And then the question is, okay, the GATT or WTO would say, well, this is fine, Article 20, you can use carbon tariffs against China or the US or Europe if they don't act. Then the question would be, what is the recipient doing? So we wanted to provide somehow a more critical view on our own work before, where we said carbon tariffs could work, and the subsequent work by Nordhaus, who basically claims that carbon tariffs is a really effective instrument, but he never ran the retaliation thing. He always said a country will take the carbon tariff and it's fine. But if you go in the second round and you do retaliation, which I think is a normal consequence of if you don't like something, then you say, well, what could I do against that, right? Then the carbon tariff is no longer effective. But here it's more maybe this goes more along than the consequences. Here I would say, well, therefore, at least journals that embrace more the idea of global concerted actions from the editor side, they would not like what we call the inconvenient insight, because the better idea would be, we have an effective instrument against somebody like Trump. And the more interesting thing here is you don't really run carbon tariffs, but you think about now the solar So we could exactly use the solar tariff that Trump announced, right? And of Korea complained, China is complaining, so we could exactly, the trade war later on has nothing to do with carbon tariffs. The carbon tariffs is our benchmark to compare whether it's worthwhile and it's a good sanctioning instrument to come back to Paris. But you could exactly run the same scenarios now with retaliation. So retaliation and tariff war, saying this is not Paris, but this is solar world or something like that, where you start now with Trump going first, other countries retaliating, and then you basically can evaluate what's happening. So therefore, I don't think this idea nowadays of retaliation and tariff wars are that unrealistic. I think there is and the message here is, carbon tariff against the US is not a good effective instrument because, here, depending on the parameterization, here it might bring them back or not, but if you go over here, then here it's clearly in the benefit of the US to extract optimal tariffs. This would not be so different from this year. The 004 would not be so different from having a classical trade policy. The 0.49 simply says, oh yeah, you could really use it and have harm against the US, but other countries would be much more vulnerable. So if the idea is if the Chinese would be the good and US would be the bad, how much leverage do we have with a tariff war? And the idea here would be China would not really in this model, in this framework, be eager to start a tariff war because the cost shares, the trade position are in favor of US. Long response, sorry, Carmelo. Yeah.
Taking into account the long-term interest of the US economy, would you recommend Trump to withdraw from Paris?
Of course not, because I believe in the fatal outcome of a climate disaster. But yeah.
No, I mean, in other words, if you put dynamic in the analysis, in the future, maybe in the short future, the scenario, technological scenario is going to change very fast, and many people are saying that renewables energy are going to be less costly than they are now, and even less cost than the conventional technologies. So it's not the Trump position is not more explained by political issues in terms of the interest of some industry in the country, that thinking in the real long-term interest of the American economy. Because doing that maybe is a way of breaking the transition, but in the long term could be a very disadvantage in terms of competitiveness in the new paradigm of global economy.
Yeah, but I have to say in favor of a Nordhaus analysis. Nordhaus, he didn't really, the reason why he did not play retaliation, he doesn't have a true multi-sector model. He uses his RISE integrated assessment model, which is more or less a one-sector model. And there these aspects, here I say what's rational for US in a very narrow sense, a very narrow short term. You say, well, if you believe in rationality, you would also say Trump should look beyond 10 years, 20, 30 years. So Nordhaus does a dynamic model, including damage functions. What you said, okay, if we don't avoid emissions, what is the bad thing for the US? And as he takes that into account, the carbon tariff works. But if in his framework, you basically change and you make the retaliation as one possibility, it's still, this is a prisoner dilemma. It's still the case that the US would then be preferring to do a free ride rather than. So I agree, there are many dimensions to the analysis, be it valuation of damages in the static framework already, be it the more dynamic in the temporal aspect that could flip-flop the results. With the one thing, the static thing, I can easily do it and show it will not. With your point, I would need a more dynamic framework and put it in there. But the fundamental problem is always, in this global good game is always free riding. And what is the payoff matrix? What are the cost of abatement versus the damages that I face? And depending on how you basically, the damage function looks like and your technology for abatement looks like, then, we all would like to see the cooperative outcome, but we do have a non-cooperative world. And so that's a little bit the challenge, which will not really go away here. So this is more in terms of saying, be careful with the carbon tariff. Maybe it's better to wait another 3 years until we have a new administration again, or basically to foster the state level action. So we had a meeting 1 week ago, because we have a little project for EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund. And there the question is how much REGI, like with climate initiatives that are on the more state level, can compensate for the missing action of the national administration. So you could basically say this would be, it would be rather cautionary about the carbon tariffs. And as I said initially, we had this one nice paper about China. In China it worked out because exactly for the reason that China has high embodied emissions, so the carbon tariff makes their imports a bit more expensive, market a bit more expensive, and if they retaliate in this narrow framework that we set there, you take the 100 billion or $10 billion loss, and you can basically say, I apply a similar loss to the US, then they could not do better. So there it was a stable game. So therefore it's not a paper saying carbon tariffs are bad and will never work, but it says, oh yeah, you have to be careful and think about what country you apply it. I think that's relatively clear. It's all about the data that matters then. And then what are the possible response dimensions of that country? I think that's and so it's more about handle with care. Whereas before we had this sequence of saying carbon tariffs, if you don't introduce a strategic aspect, are relatively ineffective because they work at the industry level and the leakage will be reduced, but global cost effectiveness will not go up a lot. So therefore carbon tariffs are not that, they are sold as a second best instrument in the theory, but if you confront the theory with the data, the improvement with the carbon tariff from a unilateral action as compared to a global emission pricing is so little. And then we said, oh yeah, but maybe we missed the strategic aspect. And with the strategic aspect, we found it's relatively effective because you drive China into emission reduction, whereas China was not in emission reduction before. That's a totally other game than saying, So then you basically could use the sanctioning instrument to bring countries with large emissions inside the abatement club, right? And then we thought, oh yeah, maybe carbon tariffs are not that bad. And then we read this article by Nordhaus, who was making also the claim carbon tariffs could be quite effective. And then we thought, but we did not really play this idea of retaliation, especially with people like Trump. So before 2016, we always fought against China. Then we had to revert, and given that the trade position is different, the results were quite different. I look to Cassiano to release the crowd that is hungry now or wants to go not to the beach. But again, thanks a lot for your, if there is no other question, I have to say this is very much, I don't say a gender divide, but we have a female here and a male here. It's by accident. And then only incidents, by accident. And then only the male put the questions, which makes me wonder, because my wife always says women are more intelligent, and if they don't ask a question, then I don't say what the quality of my talk was. Anyway, thanks a lot. Yeah.